We're hiding too many things all at once.
That's the thing.
Yes, sir.
Why don't we do the
Change
Zoom link
development
first?
today. Okay, we're live.
Oh, we are live. Welcome back to Senate Economic Development. We're shifting once again to housing, and we're looking at the CHIP proposal, which is a blend of a number of proposals, but it's basically a proposal on project-based tax increment financing for infrastructure. And at the moment, we're calling it CHIP, and we've had many experts on it, working on it, out of committee, and we're now going to look at both the proposals the working groups are making, and we have a number of policy questions still in front of us at this point. Is that a fair summary of where we are?
Yes.
Counselor Ray.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share as soon as I'm into the Zoom, but that is correct. As to, there's a few high-level policy decisions. Of course, this draft that will reflect changes that came up in discussions with Betsy and David White. So some of these will be placeholder language that's just meant to facilitate discussion. It is included here so you can think about, you can propose alternatives. Other things will be cleanup changes that we made through that process. So let me screen share. Sure, it's visible.
That salad is smelling so good. So I have to say,
It's just not tuna.
Working
lunch, so it's.
Thank you. Did you get me a salad? Yeah. Nobody got me this. Okay.
So
we have our screen share.
yeah, we're good. So we're talking about draft 3.2. First change you're going to see is the name for subchapter 7 has just been updated. You guys keep referencing this as CHIP, so I'm just accommodating that.
Great. Thank you.
Community Housing Infrastructure Program. What you see here, this wall of yellow text that's on the first page, this is placeholder language. This is not something that anyone in particular requested me to do. There was discussion last time about having affordable housing, whether that should be one of the project criteria or not. We previously had a but-for test. You'll recall I walked through how that might actually prevent increments from going to particular projects that might produce affordable housing. So this is just an approach. And the reason this is dropped in here is because this is existing legislative language. It's truly the only reason that this shows up here. This is what's in Title 24. So this is a concept of what affordable housing can be. And if you like something like this, you can retain it. You can also just reference it in one sentence, affordable housing means, and I can cross-reference to the relevant statute. But the bigger question, the high-level policy question here, is whether or not you want an affordable criteria at all to apply to this. If the point of the program is just to stimulate housing, you don't need that. If you in particular want to ensure that a portion of that housing is dedicated to affordable housing, then you'll want something like this. So that's the policy question.
Right.
I don't, I think, need to go so much through language until folks have thought about that piece.
Right. I think that's a key piece. And we're missing 2 members, but I think that the policy pieces we need to identify. This is one of the 3 key ones. We also have the increment and we also have the purpose. And affordable. David, you have a thought?
Only that, like Senator Chin's idea that for this particular bill, when we step through, all the members are here, let's go through it and approve blocks of it so that we really focus in on.
Oh, absolutely. In particular, will help us when we have the blended housing bill all together. Okay. So why don't you cruise through what
Yeah, I can tell you what the concept here is. So,
and the concept here, are we using the 575% of FPL?
I don't have that. I don't know the full extent of that proposal. I'm happy to look at language or think about the concept. I know that Betsy has that language or has at least thoughts as to how to approach that. I did want to call it the way you would need to structure it is that it would be housing that's affordable to a particular income. So you do have to have some build out. You can't just say AMI, like that's not sufficient. You have to have this kind of extensive piece, unless there's some separate certification process I'm unaware of. But the way that it works here is we're taking existing Title 24 affordable housing definitions, which treat owner occupied and rental housing differently. So to preface where we're going to come to later, the slot where substantively this comes in is project criteria. You'll recall we have that first piece that there's been some thought about dedicating 50% of aggregate gross floor area to housing. This would be a separate second project criterion that would say, and the housing development shall be an affordable housing development. But an affordable housing development is not entirely opposed of affordable housing. It's just 20% of those units are dedicated to it. So what is the affordable housing? The concept here is for owner occupied doesn't exceed 30% of the gross annual income of 120% of, and we have different criterion here, county median income, statistical area median income, statewide median income, but you're using 120% of that figure. And then the person's not meant to spend basically a third, more than a third of their income on that kind of housing. That's your owner occupied piece. For rental housing is 30% of a household and 80% of the highest of the following in similar categories here. County median income, statewide median income, like these are existing Title 24 terms. So this is not something newly created here, but those would be your two buckets. What constitutes affordable housing? And then an actual affordable housing development would be housing development of which at least 20% of the units or a minimum of 5 whichever greater are affordable housing units.
Oh, thank you.
That's a good structural question on how.
Yes, yeah, sorry, Tom.
So if for some reason we wanted to, in this application, have affordable housing have 150% of the highest of the following, we would just use this language and redefine it for the purposes of.
Exactly.
Exactly. We can
Exactly.
define this as we want. Jessica and I had talked about using the standard we use for childcare subsidies, which is a higher income up to 575% of federal of FPL. So, I mean, there are a couple things we could look at that makes it more middle income and lower, but
Exactly.
we have options in front of us. That's one of the policy points we need to plan.
And that's a really good thing to bring. I'm glad you brought that up, because if I had wanted to just have a placeholder that's the Title 24 language, I would have done a straight cross-reference. The reason the text is included here is so you can see the numbers. What you would want to do if you wanted to switch to that 575% figure, for instance, of FPL, is you would swap out this language on line 10, basically.
On page 1.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So you would just change what the relevant income criterion is as part of that definition to get it different figures. So you could tweak this to change what constitutes affordable. You can also, yeah. So the high level question is maybe the first question, and it sounds like there's some appetite to do affordable as being part of this, but that to me seems like the first question is there a commitment to doing affordable as part of this approach, or is this just about housing? And then second, if you are committed to doing affordable, what would you like affordable to even mean?
What does it mean, and what percent of the housing does affordable need to be? So there are a couple of questions in that, right?
Yeah, I think those are the two high level, like that's the steps I would take. Is first, do you want to do affordable? And then second, if you do, what do you want affordable to mean?
So, but there's one question before that, and that's housing versus other economic development.
Sure,
That's
there
the
is.
first question.
There is a, if you put aside the title of this, yes, you could ask the biggest question of all, which is if this is a project-based approach to tackling financing, is it just about housing? Which currently it is, you're right, but it could be something else. It could be a broader economic development tool like DIP districts.
So on the 30%, is that pretty common, or are we considering increasing that to like 40% of gross annual income and household at 150% of the highest of the following? Would that capture more middle income, or that's just the larger share of the
30% is the national standard
national standard?
by which it is either affordable to a family or not. And part of the problem is too many Vermonters are spending more than 30% of their income on their housing.
So we don't want to
which
tweak that.
is a problem. Yeah, we would like it, in fact, to be lower.
But the
But
120
it is 30% is the national standard for affordability for a family's budget.
But the 120 then is flexible, the 30.
120 is flexible, the 30 is a national standard, right? Now, yeah.
And we went up to 575%, that'd capture a lot of people.
Well, it's 575%
Of
of
FPL,
Okay.
of federal poverty.
Yeah,
So put it.
family of four. I'm sorry, family of four. I just ran it. It's
Jessica just identified.
Oh, I'm Jessica Hartleben, Executive Director of Betsy. For a family of four, 575% of the federal poverty guideline is $184,000 to change.
So that makes it more mixed income, which is what we've been wanting for, and more middle income. So it could be a range.
Naively have the opinion, the perspective that if we do raise that, it will also hopefully make this increment pencil out if that.
Correct.
So
Yeah,
So we could have a percent of affordable and then a percent of fair market value housing also. So I mean, that's the mix I think we have to think about is, and that we and talk about.
Yeah, and I think if you specify the portion that you want affordable, I don't know that you have to worry so much about the fair market portion of the, like, presumably the market's going to dictate that's what comes out of the end. So I guess the question I would have is if there's appetite for that FPL figure to do something like that, would you be treating, presumably you would be treating owner occupied and rental housing differently? I don't know. I will just need to know more about how that figure works and whether it's going to differentiate between owner occupied and rental housing, but it's easy enough to swap in different figures here. That's what you guys would like to do.
Okay, great.
that's the specific point for the whole committee.
This is a discussion for a value discussion for us as this bill evolves. And again, it's not going to end here. This is what the Senate's best shot is right now, what we want the housing mix to look like, what percent we want to be affordable and what percent might be fair market value and what percent might be a mixed use in other of the project. So I know we're welcoming also David White, who I think has a comment here at this point. David, do you want to weigh in here? Are you here?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, a little bit choked up here. So I would like to make the pitch that you do not include an affordable requirement within this bill. I think the value here is housing. We need housing desperately. And to the extent that you put these sorts of requirements in, it will have the tendency to discourage developers from participating. And I will add to that, given, as I said yesterday when I was there in person, that it is here. Let me turn on my video. I didn't realize it wasn't on. Sorry. Given that it's difficult to make any housing project happen right now. If you start to put affordability requirements in for a certain percentage of units or a certain level of affordability, you're simply constraining that, making it harder and harder, not easier to build housing. And the need in the state right now is so great that I would argue that the public benefit is simply housing and not to put these sorts of affordability requirements in.
So noted. Thanks. Let us keep going because that is clearly a decision point that we need to make as a committee. Great.
So,
Thank you, David.
scroll down to the bottom of page 2. I may just go super quickly through things that I worked out technically with Betsy and try to hit the high level things given our time constraints here. So financing to include the highlighted language you see here or other
That's right. What page? Page 3.
2 and 3. We're talking about the definition of financing. So this is the highlighted language you see to add or other instruments or borrowing used by a sponsor. This aligns with the language that's used for big TIF. That's what this does. So this allows the increment to be applied for other kinds of financing of the program beyond debt. Basically, that's the effect of that. Jumping down on page 3 to the definition of housing development site. So on line 7, you'll see I added as. I can explain that if you would like, but it is not super big deal here. So housing infrastructure agreement, there are some substantive changes here. So previously we had a relatively skeletal framework that basically just said this program is about financing for infrastructure. And so what the agreement covers is the municipality relationship with the the financier, so ensuring that they secure financing just for that infrastructure. And it's hoped that it will stimulate housing development. But there wasn't any part of the contractual safeguards and the like that actually applied to the housing development itself. That was treated as something that would be anticipated by the infrastructure. So it's meant to be stimulated. But because it's a core concept in this, that the housing development will have, like, it's a necessary part of the program, this brings in the housing development to the housing infrastructure agreement. So what this does is the housing infrastructure agreement now will contain conditions related to the housing development, in addition to those for just the housing infrastructure. So this is a way, I would say, of protecting against, you could include safeguards to protect against developer failure to develop that housing development. That's the quick.
Because that's a concern of BEPSI's, is what happens if it, or at least that's what I understood.
Yep.
Okay.
And I would also just say that the reason the draft previously did not include this, even though it's been a core concept all along, is that it was really just trying to get at the minimal floor necessary to get the project going. And because the program is about the increment, which only goes to financing for the infrastructure, that's why it wasn't treated here. But it may be advantageous to include it, and you can then have safeguards related to the developer and the housing development. So that's what those updates on subdivision 9 are. For improvements, some of this will be familiar to you. We're at the bottom of the page now.
Right.
Installation or construction of infrastructure, including utilities, digital infrastructure, transportation, public recreation, commercial and industrial facilities. So adding a few new indicative
Great.
items to what constitutes improvements: digital infrastructure, public recreation, commercial and industrial facilities. The only one I would fault on there is lots of these pretty intuitively fit into me with what infrastructure is. Like, think about infrastructure. Commercial and industrial facilities is not as obviously a kind of thing that's infrastructure to me, but could be. So I just want to call that out when I was dropping these in. Digital infrastructure seemed very obviously a kind of infrastructure, but these were the requested additions.
Right. And David, I know a commercial and industrial, I think is your request to add. Is that correct?
No, actually, it's not. I don't think that the funding needs to go to commercial and industrial. I think that came more from the administration, and I'm not opposed to that, but it is not coming from me. Because my focus is very much on the housing side of it. I will add, though, in this section, if I may, because I did have another comment. I've heard from a number of people in some of the more rural communities the request to add allowable use on-site or off-site private septic and water, because many of the smaller rural communities don't have municipal water and sewer, and that private on-site or off-site water and sewer or septic and water is the equivalent benefit for the rural communities, and I do support that.
I think that's essential, and I had sort of assumed that was.
So it was permissible in the first draft. At the point that we added this new language in draft 2.1 that will serve a public purpose, that's the constraint that could potentially stop exclusively private infrastructure from happening. Now, I think that was some of the debate around whether you would use the word public purpose or public good. And maybe under the concept of public good,
I think under the concept of public good, a private septic system that added 20 housing units to a town would be a public good.
Yeah, I don't have to be. I'm just saying the reason.
No, I know
that
you don't have to be
yeah,
convinced. I'm just saying it out loud.
Yeah, this was permissible in the first iteration of the draft, and then there was a request to add the public purpose constraint. And I think that the genesis of that was a conversation about who would own the infrastructure, and there was some concern that it be public. So that I just want to make sure the whole context of the conversation is clear, but you can do whatever you like.
Okay, I have the feeling there's support in this room to do on-site. So I just assumed, well, because we did have it before. I would like to add on-site septic and water and change it to public good.
Okay, I think we only need to change to good because those would naturally be utilities. So
okay, great. And Jessica, you're the one who would like us to add commercial and industrial as well. So I'm happy.
Right. So that was a proposal that the administration put forth. And I think including commercial and industrial facilities into this opens it up for the mixed use
Okay.
concepts.
Yep.
And that's really important,
Yes,
to make these
Pencil.
projects pencil out.
yeah. Got that. Okay, great. Let's keep going. Sorry.
Page 4, you'll recall that improvements includes, and the reason it includes is so you can apply the increment to the funding of debt service interest payments. The change you see here is to move from 3 years to 4 years, so the increment could be applied, debt service interest payments for up to 4 years. So this just expands the period under the thinking that you may not generate sufficient increment in those first couple of years to actually cover much of your financing. So you may need to include in your financing, the ability to pay in those first 4 years, basically. So that's why this is extended. Original taxable value, we're now down on line 9. This is a technical provision. This is just to ensure, so we've added a proviso to say that no parcel within the housing development site shall be divided or bisected. This is to ensure that the OTV for the housing development site isn't removing like a road going through the portion. So this is really a technical provision about assigning the OTV to the site. And it aligns with the approach that's taken for Big TIF. So this is technical language, I would say. We can jump down. We can jump down to the purpose section. We're on page 5.
Yeah,
So line 7. I've included the language that the chair had requested here. So
well, that was pretty modest what I sent you, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's just meant to be get a sense of
this
people's
is one of our
reaction to the-
key value discussions in committees. What is the purpose of this bill and what is the purpose of this infrastructure opportunity? And I, it's for me, anyway, so let's look at it.
Yeah, so previously it was just along the lines of stimulating housing, and now it's expanded to be stimulating housing development in Vermont's more rural village centers. I guess my personal reactions to this were obviously the scope of the program is beyond just rural village centers. It is certainly among the purposes that you would want, as I understand it, the intent is for this to stimulate development in those areas. I don't know that you have to be as specific as this.
Okay.
But interested to know what first is.
Yeah, no, so my reflection is that somewhere in Chittenden County needed, there was a housing site, but the infrastructure was insufficient to support the housing site. That's not a rural center.
Everything in Vermont is a rural.
This is more rural. This
I
is
mean,
more-
there's rural,
So why
and there's
include,
rural.
so why
But-
include?
But I think everything is, am I not correct? Everything is rural, even Burlington is
But-
considered rural.
Yeah, but village center is a specific thing.
Yes,
I recall all that, but I really, a project-based tip, I think should be just as applicable to Chittenden County or
Okay.
downtown as.
Might I propose alternative language to that line? What if it was housing development in Vermont's downtowns and rural village centers? Or in
Fine.
downtowns and village centers? It's inclusive?
or just like a development in
I just take it to
Vermont.
Vermont. Just ended at Vermont.
Housing development in Vermont.
Yep, period. Okay, fine. I just was trying to be,
Not New Hampshire?
I like where you're coming from, because this needs to.
yeah, I mean, I just, it's fine. This is just getting it for the house.
No, I think this makes sense. And I think it goes back to the point about floor speeches and like intent as opposed to a purpose.
Right.
Which might influence the definition of improvements here.
Right,
In section 1908, so at the bottom of this page, line 17, we're talking about the creation of the site on which housing development is going to occur. So what is the housing development site? Up to this point, we've just been talking about the parcels on which the housing development is actually constructed, just those parcels. That could be quite the tight area. So the new language that you see here adds and any immediately contiguous parcels. So this would be anything that's touching, surrounding that. The points I would make about this, substantively, the effect is that you expand the area so you could potentially generate more increment within that. However, it does produce this effect where we don't know what the contiguous parcels will be. So you can imagine this might create weird incentives where folks want to create housing development sites next to areas that they expect to develop otherwise. So I don't know if it would create that incentive, and I don't want to say too much about that, but I would just point out that you may want to do this to expand the area on which you would generate an increment, and it's sort of a natural thing to do here.
but
But it could produce consequences. We just don't know what.
it may have unintended consequences, so we need to monitor.
But you could also, exactly, it's like if this is an experiment to see how this thing goes, you
I
can,
think the whole thing
Yeah.
is an experiment that we all want to succeed, but it's still an experiment. the comments.
I do see some possible positive unintended consequences as I think about two parcels in Chittenden County in South Burlington where they're owned by different people, but a road's close to being there. I almost like the idea that they could start the conversation between the two of them for economies of scale and efficiencies. So I like.
Well, good.
Yeah.
I hope it will stay for the moment. Right. Good.
Let's jump to page
You
7
can
then.
check that.
So this is our housing infrastructure agreement. This is talking about the set of standards that apply. We have
So
identified,
sorry, where have you just moved to?
we're on page 7 now.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So section 1909, we have our set of standards that, pretty minimal standards applying to the agreement. The last of these, there used to be a subdivision 4 that has newly updated language. The last of these had generic language just to say something like, ensure that there are adequate protections in place for the municipality against developer or sponsor failures to perform. That language was my drafting, just to have a concept out there to say, let's include something that ensures the contract provides safeguards for the municipality, basically. This is more specific language that says to provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligations of all parties under the housing infrastructure agreement. This would have the effect of securing for all parties. So this isn't just a protection for the municipality. This is ensuring that the developer relative to the financier, the sponsor, and the like are protected. But I would say this is one version of a kind of protective element to the contract that the general concept of subdivision 4 was trying to get at before. So something to think about here. If you wanted to change the kind of safeguards in place, this would be the natural place to look to. But this just says performance insurances. You could do other things like require performance bonding and the like, but those may come up in the contractual negotiation process itself. Does that make sense?
Without lunch, yes.
I never eat lunch, so I'm just living.
I don't know how you function with that.
It's a loopy world.
I've got a muffin here. I've got chocolate. Throw chocolate at her. Okay.
Let's jump to page 8 then. And section 1910. So we're now in the section that governs the actual project application and BEPC's approval. Subdivision B here has been amended. I highlighted it. What's actually changed here is the removal of the former sentence that followed this. You'll recall that we previously included language to say that there could be staff approval for projects meeting particular location criteria, and there would be board approval required for other kinds of project criteria. That has been removed to ensure that all project applications are treated the same way, and it's just board approval required. You're not having pure administrative approval happening via staff service.
We heard that loud and clear.
So that's that update. The next piece is on page 9. The project criteria at the top of the page. So we have our at least 50% of gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing. That's something to talk about, whether you would like to be committed to that 50% figure. So all is there.
We lower that. Does that just make this more accessible in addressing some of the concerns we heard from the administration? So like 30, 40%?
So that is,
Why not stimulate economic growth right along with housing? I don't understand why it's gotta be one or the other.
I guess I would go
it
like,
can be both.
Right.
It can be both, but hopefully it is both. But I think that is how the proposal came to us at 50%. I think what we've heard in the course of conversation on this is that it may not pencil out at 50%. And that is, we're going to hear from some developers on Friday morning about how it might or might not pencil out. But I think this is one of the key conversations is if its objective is to enable more housing in Vermont. Obviously, housing is a key element, but I think we don't want to exclude additional economic development, mixed use, other opportunities for that.
so it's the community and housing improvement program. So I feel like housing has to be a part of it.
Infrastructure.
Well, that's only because we chose that name. We can make it very simple. It's project-based TIF. And then it's wide open. I mean, the name doesn't drive.
Right.
I guess I'd invoke the testimony yesterday, and what I've heard is that project-based TIFs have had more of a rough go of it, but when we approach this conversation with a focus on housing, it seems that there's more general consensus. So what if 25% housing and then that leaves 75%?
So I think this is a big conversation. It's housing and for me. So it's housing and economic development. It's housing and mixed use. I think we can't do one without the other. And I think we're using this to address a housing crisis. We also need to stimulate economic development. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they have to be and so I think we may not want to. Every project I think needs to have an element of housing in it, and whether we want to subscribe that in statute or whether we want to leave it open, that's a conversation that I think we have to have it. And at what point does it help pencil it out by adding mixed use in our language and economic development?
Given time constraints and trying to pass this bill out this week, do you want to specify just a lower figure which would accommodate mixed use? But
Yeah, and add economic development and mixed use. I think we have to.
well, so that is permissible under this, and it's just the percentage determines whether or not that's permissible or not. Basically, like if you have 25%, that means 75% doesn't have to be housed. So
we have one developer here.
25%.
Is there a one developer? I'm just going to look to Corey because we have one person who's we have two developers, but we have a private developer we're hoping to excite about everything. So as opposed to our wonderful nonprofit developer partners. When I look to both of you, I mean, we have 2 minutes before we have to probably head off to the floor. Is there a figure that makes any more sense than not, or should we keep, we want these projects to pencil out. There's no point in doing this if people aren't going to be willing to do them.
Yeah, Corey Parent, Lee and I Public Affairs, and Let's Build Homes. Obviously, from a perspective of Let's Build Homes, we want as much housing as possible, but I think flexibility is fine on that. Like, I don't know if we pick a number, whether it's 25 or 15 or 35. I would just say a project has to include an element of housing.
Yeah, I do too. And maybe a significant percent.
Yeah.
Something.
Well, if we say significant, I think then it's hard to define significant without a number, but I think we'd be okay with
an element of,
housing has to be included in the project. Leave it at that and then let the numbers play out. It might also allow Vermonters to be more entrepreneurial. I mean, that being said, understand the politics of the building that might change as we progress through this.
Exactly. Chris, you have a thought?
Chris Donnelly with Champlain Housing Trust. I really think if it's going to be a housing proposal, it should be a housing proposal. And you don't want to be stuck with 5% housing. I like 50. It's have that weight to it to really encourage the.
And we could get it to the house at 50 and then more will happen as this is evolving. But let's think about it because it's one of our decision points.
Do you guys just want me to hit, because you guys have to run in a second, do you want me to just tell you what's in the remainder of the draft?
Sure.
So we've talked about the affordable housing criterion, have added tier 2. On page 10, I can scroll down for this, but screen sharing probably.
I'm sorry, can I? Sorry, with the location criteria piece, based on what I understand is that the tiers are still being worked out. And so, based on the way the language is currently written, these projects would not be able to start until those tiers are sorted out. So in the interim, it would make sense, similar to what we did with the community recovery program, to say that we would review an application if the municipality were to provide a letter from the Regional Planning Commission to say that the project conformed with the regional plan and the municipal town plans or the town plans.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
And having that included in there so that we can get started on this in July.
Yeah, great.
And I think, sorry, Madam Chair, if I may,
Just identify yourself.
Alex Barrow, Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development. To me, what that achieves is you see that the language is drafted to also include interim exemption areas. but those are somewhat a proxy for tier 1A and 1B. Given the intentional shift to include tier 2, I think it also it's logical to add something to give sort of a tier 2 proxy, and this RPC support is, I think, a logical way to
Okay.
achieve that.
Can you
I will draft language and send it
and
over.
get it to John?
Yeah. Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah.
David is good with that too. Great. And anything else before we run? Oh, gosh, yes.
The debt incursion period is extended to 5 years with the possibility of a 3-year extension from Vet C. So that's opposed to 3 years. That means the municipality pursuing a project would have potentially 5 or 8 years to take on debt that they could finance with the tax increment. There's some technical provision throughout the remainder. One thing I would note is that direct payment of the increment toward the project is now permitted under section 1910C. So that's uses of tax increments, but we can talk about these things when you guys have more time. I realize this.
Yes, because we also need to talk about the percent of increment going to the municipality.
Yes, and this latest draft has not less than 100%, so it's all the municipal tax increment would be going toward the project, which is kind of like a
Going to
Good
pay
thing.
the bond, the municipal money would be going to pay the bond then.
yes,
Right, but the education property tax
would be
is
up
still
to
80/20.
up to 80. Up to 80. That's right.
Okay, so more to follow. Thank you. Anything else you want to say before we go? David?
I do
John?
have one thing, if I may. I think technical but important. On pages 14 and 15, it talks about the timing of the commencement of the 20-year period for attaining the education increment. And right now, as drafted, it says that it starts when you incur the debt. That has the effect of actually reducing the retention period for 2 to 3 years, because when you borrow the municipality or the developer, whoever it is, borrows the money, it's probably 2 to 3 years before the project actually hits the tax rolls and starts to pay the incremental new taxes. And so you lose that 2 to 3 year period because there is no increment during that period of time while the construction is happening.
I have just lost, sorry, but we've just lost, we have to get to the floor.
Okay.
Could you and John connect on that?
We
Because
we talked. I need you guys to make a decision. Like
okay,
I can't.
so that's part of our increment decision making.
Yeah, and I can talk to you